I won't have you go back to Kevin's slides, but I will point out that a railroad filled with bluebonnets and a railroad with an elephant on it is not a typically American railroad. So, having said that, I'm going to start about 50,000 feet. We have 10 minutes, and I'm only going to scratch the surface. When we get to the working group, hopefully there'll be an opportunity to ask a few more questions. What you need to know about the railroad is that we haul about 40% by weight of all the freight that moves in the United States. Not Union Pacific, all of the railroads. If all of that were to go by truck, you would not have any room on your roads for cars. So the function of the railroad is to move all that freight from point A to point B. I think everybody knows that. Most of you interact with the railroad because we're in your way when you're trying to get to work. We are on your crossing, right? There's a lot more to know about railroads. Union Pacific is the largest railroad by most measures in the United States. This is our operating territory that you see here. Of course, most of you are looking at that from the slide, from Chip's slide, right? And you're seeing that Monarch corridor. The other thing you need to know about that building America for 150 years, we were founded by Abraham Lincoln 154 years ago by an act of Congress. We've been active 149 years running freight. All of those tracks you see, a lot of them are 150 years old. They started out as a couple mile wide corridors as a land grant from the government. They obviously are a lot narrower than that. We run minimum of 20 feet wide corridor. That's an extraordinarily narrow corridor. More typically, they're about 150 feet wide corridors. A lot of them are virgin prairie. They have never been touched by a plow because they're 150-year-old right-of-way corridors. That makes us different and extremely valuable to what you're doing here. We're not new to the conservation world. We kind of coexisted with the national parks. National parks were created by definition because they were in beautiful places, and a lot of those beautiful places were generally inaccessible. The railroads were the only thing that could get to a national park. For many years, up until the 1970s, Union Pacific provided all of the commissary services at the Zion, Bryce, all those Utah parks. We continue to provide services. So we've been part of that American landscape for as long as we've existed, and we recognize that because we have a role in serving conservation and preservation interests. Now, our emphasis on the environment is a lot more direct. We are 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks. Because we operate steel wheels on steel rail, there's no friction to speak of. We can operate extremely efficiently. That's not to say we don't use a lot of fuel. We do. But because of what we've done in terms of conservation, we have saved 2.5 billion gallons of fuel through our conservation efforts since 2000. We are also far more environmentally friendly in that we have a lot less emission. This is the focus of our conservation. We take it very seriously. Frankly, it's part of our brand as a rail industry. We are the clean solution for freight transportation. We even help our customers figure out what their carbon emission estimator is if they use us versus using trucks. But we've also been in the business of direct conservation for a long time. I'm going to start several years ago and kind of work forward. This is a very successful project in Idaho. Started back in the 1970s, actually. 1990s, but it's been a long time in the making. This is a defunct railroad, no longer active, the kind that you see bluebells sprouting in, right? 72 miles up in northern Idaho, and it was reconverted into a conservation project. It was highly contaminated. It took a lot of work. We still have maintenance. Once we are responsible for cleanup, we're always responsible for cleanup, even when this becomes a state park. So we're continuing to cooperate on that. This actually was a regional winner of a Phoenix Award from the EPA. So we've been doing this for a long time. I had to put an Iowa slide in here, right? I was on the board of the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation for many, many years, and so I have a particular fondness there. This high trestle trail, if you are a bicyclist, you need to get to Iowa. We have converted a whole lot of trails or railroads to trails. This is one of the most famous ones where this bridge that you see was repurposed, another award-winning project. You can see the corridor there where we turn a railroad, an old railroad, into a rail corridor. The conservation changes are obvious. So what about what you're trying to do with pollinators? there's not a whole lot of railroads being abandoned anymore. We've kind of right-sized the railroad. We're using what we have. It's important that we use what we have so that we can deliver all those goods without more trucks, without taking up more road space. But we also understand that the corridors that we occupy, that map that I showed you at the beginning, has some real value for monarch conservation. So we're trying to figure out how can we get into this pollinator project. So we've got this clear connection, right? 1 million acres, never been plowed, very linear acres. You don't have to have a lot of width, right? You don't need pockets here and there. Sometimes you need linear corridors, that's us, native soils, but there's problems. We are an operating corridor. We're not a pipeline where you kind of run through there and occasionally you have to go out and do tests on your pipeline. We are not an electric transmission corridor. We're an active railroad. We run as many, in some of our corridors, we run as many as 120 trains a day through our corridor. We have to be concerned about the safety of our crew, of our maintenance folks. They go out there at least once a week, sometimes once a day to do maintenance. We're out there all the time and we have to be worried about their ability to function to do their job. We have been successfully sued by an employee who contracted West Nile. Now, we got it overturned, but we have to think about those kinds of things when we're thinking about conservation. Bee stings might be a lawsuit. So when we're thinking about conservation, we have to think about it from a business perspective. We also have to think about it from a shareholder perspective. We have to think about the cost. It is really easy to put a maintenance piece of equipment on the railroad and just go spray and just go mow. It's simple. We do it once, maybe twice a year, depending on the part of the country that we're in. In order for us to have corridors that are appropriate for pollinators, we have to figure out how we make that work from a maintenance standpoint that is not significantly more expensive. We also only want to plant once. We can plant other stuff once. That's not how it works with prairie, right? We all know that. Anybody who's ever tried to establish a prairie, you know it doesn't work the first time. It takes effort. We really need a lot of folks to help us figure out how do we do this just once and make it work. So we're learning through other people's expertise. We are collaborating with the Wildlife Habitat Council. We're working with their right-of-way group. We have some pilot locations where we've got, right now we're focusing on 3 kinds of things, either where we have non-operating property, so we may have a few acres in a location where we say, okay, we're not operating there, or an abandoned railroad, where we might have a site remediation. In other words, it was an old lead smelting property, right? We're going to have to remediate that piece of property. We know we have to do work. Where it has to be planted anyway, that's another location. Those are the kinds of things we're looking for now. So we're looking in a lot of different geographies, California, Texas, Nebraska, Wyoming. Again, we only want to have to seed it once. We don't want to have to do a lot of maintenance. But we're looking for whether we can expand that to other kinds of properties, and that's where we're going to use expertise. This is a current project we've got in California, former asbestos mine between San Francisco and LA, and this is where we're actually doing a pollinator project. All of you in the room understand those are good after pictures, right? There's a lot of folks who are like, it's all brown. That's not a good after picture. There's nothing growing there. Well, that's a dry season. But it's really been a very successful project. This is the one that meets all the criteria. It's a remediation site, it's non-operating, and we had to plant it anyway. So now the next step is, do we have projects that are going to be on operating property where we can find a way that we can work with pollinators? There are a lot of things that get in our way that I just described before, but we're hopeful that we can find some places where we can collaborate. Thanks.